So, welcome back from the break. Let's continue. So, as I explained in the first half, we want to make the world a better place, specifically by increasing people's quality of health and/or life. And we do this through interventions which work through people, specifically through people's psyche. These interventions can work if and only if they contain behavior change methods that are effective. And as I explained earlier, that is not so easy. Why does she start the meeting twice? I hope this won't be like every 10 seconds. So they can only work if they contain behavior change methods that are effective, because even though organisms evolved the capacity to learn, that was never developed to use in interventions by other people. So that means that if you want to leverage these learning capabilities, there are quite narrow bandwidths within which you have to operate. Not only do you have to get that right, you also have to make sure that you target behavioral determinants that are actually relevant for the target behavior. And more specifically, within those determinants, you have to target the right subdeterminants, the right representations people have about consequences of the behavior, about whether they like those consequences, about what other people think they should do, about what other people do, about obstacles there may or may not be, about their ability to do a behavior. There are loads of different determinants. These are the RAA ones, the recent action approach ones, but there are many more from many different theories. So you have to identify the right things to change. That's what you do in step 2. And then you have to use your knowledge about which constructs they belong to select the correct methods to target those things to change, those subdeterminants. And those you put in your intervention, and then hopefully at the right moment, the right signal will be sent to people's muscles and they make the right movements or they say the right things, and then they will be happier and/or healthier. These methods for behavior change that you select in step 3 are defined at the same level as determinants. So they're defined at the generic abstract level. And that's because psychologists, and hopefully that will change at some point, but as of now, most of psychology still kind of seems to think that you can study humans and they're all the same everywhere pretty much. So you make a questionnaire for attitude or depression and you just give it to people. The only exception pretty much being children. Because of this idea, this underlying idea in psychology, we tend to study the human psyche, so constructs, so determinants, at a very generic level, so that it actually generalizes over contexts and situations and cultures, etc. Similarly, we study methods for behavior change, so that it generalizes across populations and contexts, etc. Hopefully, at some point, we'll move towards the realization that actually people's psyche are not all the same everywhere. The fact that people have 2 arms doesn't mean that their psyche is organized the same, regardless of age or culture or etc. But for now, the idea is that everything is the same for everything and everybody and never really changes. So that means that these methods and these determinants are studied at a very generic level. Of course, that means that as such, you can never use them for behavior change, for an intervention, because if you want to develop an intervention, you don't communicate with people at a generic abstract level. You don't say, because of modeling, you have to have a higher attitude. You have to do actual things in an intervention that relate to the world as people perceive them. So that means you have to communicate with people on the level of the subdeterminants, specific expectations people have. And that also means that you have to translate the methods to something at that very specific level. And those things are called practical applications. So an application is the way you put a method in an intervention, so to speak. So if we take modeling, the behavior change method that uses vicarious learning, so you expose people to a peer that they can identify with, that then models, shows the desired behavior and gets positively reinforced for this behavior. This method can be implemented in an application that is a comic or a VR intervention or a movie or in role-playing. The way it looks on the surface can be vastly different because it doesn't work because of how it looks on the surface. It works because of the change principles that it engages and the underlying evolved learning processes that those leverage. And those you can't see, so that means the way it looks doesn't really allow you to, well, you can infer it if you know your shit, but it doesn't directly tell you how it works. So you have the methods for behavior change, and you translate those into practical applications, and then you take into account these parameters for effectiveness. So the kind of like the borders prescribing this narrow bandwidth within which you have to operate. Characteristics of the population, characteristics of the culture, characteristics of the context, basically everything that determines your specific intervention. And you take them all into account to translate them to an application that works. If you develop an application to deal with loneliness among incels, like involuntary celibate people, those are generally relatively young and generally relatively online. So that means you have a lot of practical applications at your disposal that leverage the internet, for example. If you develop an intervention for elderly in a suburb somewhere with an average age of 85, 90, you will probably have a lot fewer online application possibilities at your disposal. So that means that characteristics of your population, of the context, of the type of behavior, they all determine which applications you can use and which you can't use. So if you have modeling based on these attributes, you could translate it to a practical application that's role-playing, or a movie on TV, or a billboard, or anything. So the applications are what you actually build. That's what you will go to an executive agency with, like a web designer, or somebody who makes a movie, or somebody who writes a story. And they work because they implement those theoretical methods. So those are the last three links in the causal structural chain. So you target subdeterminants with those applications. And the applications work because they contain behavior change principles, and because those are applied according to the parameters of use, or the conditions for effectiveness, or even parameters for effectiveness. One of these chains explains how you expect to change one subdeterminant, and how you expect that that change will contribute to a change in the target behavior. So, for example, your target behavior, to give a random example, could be to dose ecstasy within the recommendation, which is 1 to 1.5 milligrams of MDMA per kilograms of body weight, in case you plan to use MDMA. Also, if you plan to use MDMA, get it tested. That's by far the most important harm reduction. You can do it in Maastricht, I think, with the municipal health services. But I'm not sure. And if you do want to use ecstasy and you don't know where to get it tested, I can, or Rob, we can find out and tell you, because it's seriously by far the most important harm reduction practice. So if you dose ecstasy within the recommendation, then one of the sub-behaviors is deciding to use a high dose. Deciding to use a high dose is a bit of a tricky behavior because it's not a visible behavior, which can be confusing to people. But in intervention mapping, we quite often use the decision to do the behavior as a kind of backup behavior so that we can put all the determinants there that we know are relevant, but that don't explicitly link to one of the other performance objectives. For example, a lot of considerations about that the umbrella behavior is healthy isn't, for example, let's take condom use again. So let's say we distinguish three sub-behaviors: buying the condoms, negotiating condom use with your partner, and properly applying the condom. Then the awareness that condoms prevent pregnancy, if used properly, doesn't relate specifically to one of those three performance objectives. It's just important for the whole condom use thing. And then adding a behavior like deciding to have safe sex or deciding to use condoms helps because you can just put it there. And then, because again, in intervention mapping, making the matrices and making the ABCD, those are just tools to not miss stuff. Intervention mapping basically exists to make sure that you identify all the bits of psyche that are relevant, then develop an intervention that targets it with stuff that might work, and do this all in a way that can work for your target population, using the planning group, using pre-testing, talking to people, and then implementing and evaluating. But it's basically a list of stuff that you shouldn't forget. Okay, so this sub-behavior is predicted by people's attitude, towards deciding to avoid a high dose. And one of the subdeterminants is the expectation that if you use a high dose, time seems to pass faster. Which people generally, not always, but generally find undesirable, because ecstasy use in the Netherlands is quite often related to large dance parties, which are expensive. Not only the tickets, but also your expenses there. Which means that if you go there and you use ecstasy to augment your experience, so to speak, you don't want it to only seem to last an hour and still cost 150 euros. Then, one of the methods that we know we can use to target attitudes successfully is persuasive communication. And we can decide to create an infographic using persuasive communication. And then we know that one of the parameters of use is that the message has to be perceived as relevant by the target audience. So that means that in the pre-testing, one of the things we want to check is whether it is perceived as relevant. If not, we change it. So this shows all the assumptions we have about why this bit of the intervention should contribute to change in the target behavior. So if you have this overview of an intervention, of all the causal structural change they included, you know completely what they want to do. And of course there are loads of those causal structural change. And it's important to have many, because if you fail to change the subdeterminant, because actually, despite how psychologists approach people are different, if you fail to change the subdeterminant, you lose the entire chain. And similarly, if you use a method that doesn't work, you also use the chain. And if you target a subbehavior that's not relevant for one person, you also lose the chain, etc., etc. So that's why you want to have as many of these as possible, given, of course, the resource constraints, because generally you don't have enough time and you don't have enough money. So you have to compromise and select what you target. But you basically want as many as possible, because you know, unless you have an intervention that you develop for one individual, you know that not everything will be valid for everybody. So the idea of the ABCD, the acyclic behavior change diagram, is that it's created based on a matrix, which is this matrix, which is basically just your causal structural change in a spreadsheet. Ta-da! And the nice thing about this is, even though it's something that actually we should probably write something about because it doesn't get enough attention. So the diagram is nice, but this, because it's a spreadsheet, is machine readable, which means that if people publish an intervention, you will be able to import this and immediately know exactly why they think it's targeted, without a human having to look at the paper or the diagram. So if you have this, you can convert it into the diagram, which is the same, but in a diagram, and it collapses cells that represent the same thing in reality, so to speak. So it collapses all the determinants, but only within a subbehavior, because of course, if you have attitude for two different subbehaviors, they are two different things in reality. And it collapses all the same subbehaviors, etc. So here, the ABCD is much easier to discuss with lay people in your planning group or other experts that are not behavior change experts, etc. So it ends with the target behavior. You generally have only one, because you generally have only one for a target population. And then it explicates how you think the target behavior consists of subbehaviors, which determinants predict those subbehaviors. Then the most important column, so to speak, also the highest column, the subdeterminants that you will target, so the specific bits of people's psyche that you can expect to change because of your intervention. And then which behavior change methods you use and how you translated those into practical applications and which those target. As you see here, one practical application can also target multiple change objectives. And it's also true that one application can contain multiple methods. And one method can be in multiple applications, of course. They're just tools. Okay, so that's what you will create in step 3, using either Gemovi, which is a statistical package for which you can develop modules, so you can create this using Gemovi as well, or this app, which will be in the course materials. And if you use the app, you click on data, then what I always do is make a Google Sheet, because it's easy to collaborate. And then if you make sure it's viewable by clicking share at the top right, I guess everybody's kind of familiar with Google Sheets by now, but just in case. So if you click share, you can make sure everybody can view it. And then you can copy the URL, paste it there, then it will import it. And then you can click generate plot, and then it will generate a plot. And then if you want to export it, you can export it as SVG, which is a file format that can be edited offline. So you can drag stuff around or change colors or whatever. The colors here are the colors that we introduced a while back to help people distinguish concepts. Because, I mean, you all have the benefit that you're psychology students, but we also teach this to people from practice who may have no background in psychology. And remember earlier when I explained that it can be a bit confusing that constructs, subdeterminants, are formulated as behaviors, as change objectives. People already struggle with what a behavior is and a determinant before they get to that level. So it can be super confusing to people what a behavior actually is and what a subdeterminant or a determinant is. So that's why you see these colors everywhere. But you can change them, of course, because it's your life. Okay, so if you want to change them, select SVG, and then you can use Adobe Illustrator or an excellent open source program called Inkscape to edit them. There's also some documentation which you probably won't need. So, to give the overview picture, you use either cyberplots or something else to select the subdeterminants, determinants to target. Then you put those in the matrices of change objectives. Then you add those into the ABCD matrix, and you also add the 3 columns to the left, the methods, the parameters, and the applications. So just to be clear, the 4 columns at the right of the ABCD matrix are identical to the matrix of, I mean not identical, but they contain exactly the same information. So it's just copy-pasting from the matrices of change objectives, because it's just change objectives, sub-behaviors, behaviors, and determinants. Then you can use these to create the ABCDs, and those you can then discuss with advertising agencies, other stakeholders, etc., until you think it will work in your context, for your target population, for any intermediates, etc. And then eventually you'll have the intervention. This specific intervention I'll explain a little bit more about how that process works to put things a little bit in perspective. Okay, so to wrap up step 3, you also have to answer which applications you want to combine. Because quite often you have a lot of applications, but you might have 3 classes in high school that you have to put them all in. So then you have to think about what do we begin with, what do we do at the end, etc. Sometimes you just combine everything in one. It's simple, you just have one component, but sometimes you have multiple. If you have multiple, you also have to think about the order. As I explained earlier, whenever you want to emphasize potential risks or negative effects of behavior, that can often be perceived as threatening by the target population, which means that it's important that they feel self-efficacious before you do this. So then you would first focus on skills and on self-efficacy, and when that's high, then you can start presenting risk information, for example. If you have an intervention where you have discussions, where you have something interactive, or where copywriters write stories or something, you need to have some kind of scoping of what's discussed and what isn't discussed. And often you have a kind of theme, something that kind of is the online presence, the identity of your intervention. So these are called the components, the sequence, the scope, and the themes of the intervention. And those you also have to develop. For how to develop these, we don't have the fine-grained procedures that we had so far. So this is mostly just thinking, talking to the target population as well. Because the theme, for example, you don't really care because it doesn't work. It's not an active ingredient. So whatever makes your target population happy, go for it. Okay, so this is what you do in step 3. You generate these, the themes, the components, the scope, and the sequence. You choose those behavior change methods, and then you convert those into applications. Very important to keep checking the change objectives, because it's a lot of information and you might miss some and you don't want to. And very important to supervise the executive organizations. And of that, I will have an example later. So you start in intervention mapping with the needs assessment, Because generally, when people approach you to solve something, the problem turns out to be actually something different. So it's worthwhile to do your own research and find out the lay of the land, so to speak. Then you find out why people do what they do. Then you match this to methods and you develop applications to change what they do, or to support them in changing. Then you wrap this all together in an intervention in step 4, and you pre-test the intervention to optimize it, the probability that it will be effective. And then you have 2 special steps. I mean, they're all special, but these are more special. Step 5, implementation, because you anticipate it on the implementation from the beginning. Already in step 1, you think about who might be intermediates in your intervention. If you know you'll likely do something in schools, you make sure you have a school teacher in your planning group. That's already thinking about your implementation. And in step 5 specifically, you start thinking about who has to do what, and then basically doing intervention mapping all over for the implementers. So that if you have something that's rolled out here in the hospital, for example, and nurses have to do something, that the nurses actually will do it. So you map the determinants of the nurses, and you basically create an entire intervention for the nurses, which you will then have to implement. So then you create an intervention for their managers. And then you create so basically you can keep going, but of course it all makes sense, right? It all increases the probability that everything will work, but you generally have limited time and resources. And evaluation is also special because you also anticipate on that from the beginning. And that's one of the reasons why the change objectives are formulated as behaviors in step 2, because that makes it much easier to evaluate them afterwards. And then ideally you can go back to step 1, because often, even though this is all a lot of work and you do it all painstakingly and diligently, generally interventions don't suddenly completely solve the problem. So ideally you can then go back and find out what you missed and what you still have to change. In that sense, on a larger time scale, smoking is a good example. So the sequence of interventions that were implemented for smoking worked quite well. And yet now you have kind of 2 groups. People kind of getting launched into nightlife and then picking up smoking when they're young. And the people who are the hardcore smokers who haven't stopped smoking despite everything. And they, of course, have very different determinants than the people who did start smoking over the past 20 years. Over the past 20 years. So ideally you keep iterating and finding out more and learning more. Okay, now a bit of a more, well, not necessarily cynical, but an important an important element to put things into perspective. So I already don't know how many years ago, I was involved with Party Panel, and in Party Panel we did 5 subsequent determinant studies in Dutch nightlife, studying 5 different behaviors, risk behaviors in nightlife settings. One of them was the example I used so far, using a high dose of MDMA. Another one was using hearing protection, for example. Another one was boundary transgressing behavior, to translate directly from Dutch. So basically flirting, kissing, sex, but then making sure you respect people's boundaries. Basically consent, but the other non-consent, you could call it. Based on this determinant study, fortunately, one of the organizations responsible for implementing interventions around sexual health in the broad sense was interested in developing an intervention using these determinants. And the whole idea of Party Panel was that we would do these determinant studies and then provide the cyberplots to the practical organizations who then have the evidence they need to do interventions. Because they don't always have time and resources or knowledge to do these determinant studies. So we were like, we do the determinant studies, we provide the results to them, then they basically finish step 2, so to speak, then they can select what to target and develop effective interventions. And they basically were like, oh great, let's do this. So we started working with them. We had these cyberplots. They're in Dutch, but they are there. And then we provided the cyberplots to the agencies, the advertising agency that was going to create the intervention. We also showed them ABCDs and suggested that they work with those so that we could easily discuss about the methods they would want to use and stuff. So the first concept they came with was this one. So just in case you've never been in one of those sessions with advertising agencies, what they do is that they pitch a number of concepts. And they have a group of professionals in their organizational structure called the creatives, who kind of create the concepts. And that's kind of approached as a kind of magic almost. Like they don't have procedures. It's like a very much like art more than a science, so to speak. So the idea is they create these kind of concepts, and these concepts come with a few visuals and with a narrative. And during the pitch, they pitch these narratives supported by the visuals. So this is what they did, and the story is kind of at the left, how they explain how the intervention would work. Then they want to use models. As you see here, the plan was to use models who are artists. We then explained that you can't use artists because people don't relate to artists, so they won't actually copy the behavior. They also kind of try to make a matrix of change objectives, even though there are no sub-behaviors on the left and there are no determinants at the top, but it's a matrix, so that's already kind of positive. And then they have this as a kind of explanation about how it would work, which is quite advanced. Not all advertising agencies do this. And they created this as a kind of approximation of the ABCD. Of course, I wasn't super happy because the whole point of the ABCD is that you need those 7 assumptions in the links of the causal structural chain. So I don't want something that looks like this. I want something that expresses those assumptions. But they did their best, so that's already a good thing. That was the first concept, so they actually had some backup. Then the second concept was this. And the idea was that this was very easy to ask, and you can relate as any of the individuals in this scene, like the potential perpetrator, the potential, as I learned now when I was in the Code of Conduct Committee for a conference, not the victim, but the potential reporter of an incident, can also think, hey, am I still okay with this? And then they explain, okay, so it's easy for everybody to check. So if we only agree to this, to just use this and check with yourself, check with others, then it's solved. And in the narrative, you can kind of already imagine the world being like this. You can kind of already imagine, oh yeah, that is it. If we would agree that, then of course this kind of completely ignores that it's super hard for people to actually, especially if your boundaries are being transgressed, to then do anything at all. And as a bystander as well, because social situations are vague. So you're never really sure whether people like it or not. So people are afraid of intervening, etc. That's kind of ignored a bit here. They again created kind of matrices. And then have the third concept, where they explain that flirting is nice, at least if it's respectful. Because if everybody is kind to each other, kind is lief in Dutch, L-I-E-F. That's the word, the second word on the third line here. Or the first word on the third line here. That means kind. I explain that because it's relevant later. So the idea is, if you cross boundaries, that's not flirting, that's just going too far. So let's all just agree that flirting is okay, but we will all be kind to each other. We will all be lief. So then the concept was this, which is laat ik echt flirten, which is Dutch for let me really flirt. And then the idea is that this then somehow changed all those subdeterminants and then changed the behavior. This process is kind of hard because you speak different languages. So we know what determinants are. We know what behavior change methods are. People at advertising agencies don't. They don't generally hire people who are trained in intervention mapping. Which on the one hand is a good thing, because these advertising agencies also work for Heineken. So, and they also sell fat bikes or thin bikes or whatever. They also do behaviors that generally we as prevention people, behavior change people, try to counteract, because we know that in society in general they do more harm than good. So in a sense it's good that they don't speak this language, but it also has some problems in interaction, because the creatives, of course, consider parameters of use that they have to consider as constraints on their creativity, and rightly so, because they are. The point is that creativity is not an active ingredient. So something can be super creative and it will do nothing. If it doesn't engage people's evolved learning processes, people don't learn. So if it doesn't use effective behavior change methods, nothing will change. But that, of course, is hard to explain to people who are called creatives. So this is what they eventually ended up creating. The idea is that you have this question, are you okay? And still, it was based on supporting people to ask this question to each other, also from the bystander perspective. And they did add a thing where they had movies where people were interviewed. It's called behavioral journalism as a method, where like normal people, not celebrities or something, are asked about similar situations, and then stories are selected that target the right subdeterminants. And because it's actually real, you see that if you see the movies. So that means that people relate much more to the people who are being interviewed, of course. So that's a bit more depressing example. One of the things that was from the same study, and that's just fun, so I included it. But it also shows how complicated this is. We asked people, and this is all in nightlife, right? These was all determinate studies in nightlife settings in the Netherlands. So we asked when people feel that somebody else crosses their boundaries for 3 situations: where they dislike them, where they liked them but hadn't really done anything yet, and situations where they were flirting with them. And then we ask these questions on the left side. So if you ask whether these things are considered as something that crosses your boundaries, for somebody you don't like, we got this. So people generally consider if they don't like somebody and they touch their crotch, it's considered boundary transgressing. That's something we could maybe have predicted without doing the study. The sexual compliment is not considered boundary transgressing by about 30% of the people here. And asking whether you want to kiss the person is considered transgressing, depending on how you define it, by over half of the people. So this shows that asking for consent can be considered boundary transgressing, which is a bit tricky, of course. Oh, the x-axis is just a percentage, sorry. So there were 5 categories, because there were 5 answer options, like I consider it not at all boundary transgressing to I consider it very much boundary transgressing. So yellow is very much boundary transgressing, that should be on the left side there. And purple is not boundary transgressing at all. So, can we do the color coding in cyber? This? Yes, I think so. I'm not sure, but in 2 weeks I have a meeting with Rick and Jeroen to create Cyborg, which will be a better version of cyber, which will have much more flexibility. So soon that will be it. We still have to tweak the acronym a bit so that it makes sense. Okay, so the point here is that actually asking whether people want to kiss you is not always appreciated. It can be considered boundary transgressing, which kind of also makes sense, right? Because you pose a question, so you request an answer. People might not like telling people that they don't like them. People might consider the question threatening in itself. Okay, if you are attracted to somebody, still the question is considered kind of boundary transgressing by about half the people. That's without having been flirting, right? Just purely the question. It can also be because social situations are just hard and complicated, especially when intimacy comes into play. But we thought this was an interesting finding. Also here, you see that just kissing is considered as boundary transgressing by fewer people. That kind of makes sense, right? I mean, if you like somebody and they kiss you, it's okay compared to when you don't like somebody. Now, if you look at somebody you're flirting with, you see that only about, I don't know, a quarter, 33% considers it as boundary transgressing if you ask whether somebody wants to kiss. But we also see that a similar percentage doesn't consider it boundary transgressing when you do immediately kiss. So if you ask, there is quite a third probability that people think that you cross their boundaries. If you immediately kiss, there's a 1/3 probability that they don't consider that you cross your boundaries. Of course, on the one hand, this is nice because it illustrates how complicated it is. As soon as you start thinking about that people are just different, and people have different thresholds in what they like and don't like, it's not so super shocking. But for a random person, being in a social situation with somebody that they would like to interact with. This can be hard, especially because people don't always pick up clearly when you are flirting. We also, maybe I should add those as well, ask people of these same things whether they sometimes use them when they are flirting. And there you also see that that's it's not like people say, like everybody is like, yes, I always use compliments and I never use shoulders on hands or backs. That just varies a lot between people. So in practice, lots of people just do stuff and people don't always pick up signals or communicate clearly what they want. And communicating clearly what you want can cross somebody else's boundaries. So it's not actually even unequivocally the advice you want to give. Of course, the alternative would be to completely eliminate the entire gray area and communicate explicitly about everything. But of course, that has its drawbacks as well. Okay, that was one example. Now I have two more movies which illustrate kind of why they kind of make the same point I made earlier about how there's quite a gap between what you learn here and practical organizations you work with. These party panel determinant studies we did those to create those cyber plots and then send them to prevention organizations to then take those and use step 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and create interventions. It turned out that they had no idea. So when we sent the cyber plots, they were like, what is this? What do I do with this? Which kind of makes sense because of course not everybody was trained here or in behavior change. But when we went to talk to them, it turned out actually they often didn't really have knowledge about statistics, which makes it kind of hard to select determinants. So then we actually managed to get a little bit of money more, and then we created movies that kind of show the level at which, even though you learned all this here now, you have to communicate to organizations that actually develop interventions. Let's see whether that directly works. No, but that might be. No. Well, then, weird though. Okay. Since we are quite good for time, I'll just open a second presentation. Which just has to load. Very slow, so I hope this will pay off. At least we have a play button now, that's a good sign. Aha.
How do you develop effective interventions to change risk behavior among partygoers? First, you have to know why they behave like this. Unfortunately, simply asking, hey, why do you do this, is not enough. Our behavior is affected by a combination of environmental factors and personal beliefs about this behavior. Mostly, we're not aware of these. In order to find out which beliefs determine risk behavior of partygoers, we set up Party Panel. We work according to different theories on behavioral change. One of these is the reasoned action approach. It holds that these beliefs can be divided into 3 categories. Attitude. This is about the expected consequences of this behavior and how we evaluate those. Perceived norms. This is about how you think others approve and compete others to themselves. And perceived behavioral control. This is about whether you think you can successfully perform this behavior. All beliefs we study come from experts and a group of participants and are measured in questionnaires that are filled out by participants online. The answers to the questionnaires provide an insight strongly affect their behavior. As an example, let's take the behavior brushing your teeth. Let's say you want to make people who don't brush their teeth enough brush more often by means of an intervention. First, you need to understand why they don't brush their teeth often enough. You want to know which beliefs people have about the consequences of not brushing their teeth often enough and how important they are. For example, the premise, if I don't brush my teeth often enough, it's more likely that I'll get cavities, and I definitely don't like cavities. Or, if I do brush my teeth often enough, this will surely freshen my breath, and I like that. But you also want to know what people assume about opinions and behavior of others, and how important this is to them. For example, my girlfriend likes it if I brush my teeth twice a day, and her opinion matters to me. And you also want to know how easy or just how difficult it is to brush your teeth often enough. I don't brush my teeth more often because I often forget. This shows low perceived behavior control. I always have enough to clear out so it's possible that people expect that brushing their teeth often enough reduces the risk of cavities, but that it doesn't affect their behavior. At the same time, it is possible that a partner's opinion does strongly predict whether they brush often enough. So, an ad featuring a happy girlfriend will have a strong impact on your dentist giving advice. Once you know which beliefs most strongly predict the behavior you wish to change, you can start figuring out which methods are most likely to be effective. For more info about the behaviors we have studied using Party Panel and...
So you see how this kind of very, very briefly summarizes step 2, but also how it probably reinforces the idea or creates the idea in whoever watches it, if they don't know anything about behavior change, that those are the 3 determinants of behavior, and then you're done. The idea that actually they are not really arbitrary, but they're just ways to slice the human psyche, and there are loads of ways, and you have to find all the balls, so to speak, is not there. How you intervene, and that's about learning, and that actually you have a small bandwidth in which you have to operate. If you then want to change any of these, was also lost. But we only had like 2 or 3 minutes to create this movie. So this is one of the things we created. And then the idea was that this was a background movie for the ones with the actual results. So we planned to send cyberplots, which show this very nuanced view of the population and what people believe and how it's associated to attitude, intention, behavior, whatever. And then would allow the organizations to make an educated choice into what to target based on which subpopulation they want to target and stuff. So that became this.
How do you develop effective interventions to change risk behavior and multi-goals? First, you have to know why they behave like this. Unfortunately, simply asking, hey, why do you do this, is not enough. Our behavior is affected by a combination of environmental factors and personal beliefs about this behavior.
Oh, wait, is this the second one? The same one, huh? Ah, sorry, this one. But now at least the beginning is very well engraved in your mind.
In 2015, we conducted a survey among 868 participants who go out and use ecstasy from time to time. We asked them about different beliefs related to 3 specific behaviors: buying highly dosed ecstasy pills, using a high dose of MDMA, having ecstasy pills tested. In this video, we highlight using a high dose of MDMA. This part of the panel showed that the intention of using a high dose of MDMA is related to the belief that this will affect the positive effects like intoxication, experiencing a longer and more intense high, and connecting more easily with others. That you can say no when someone offers you MDMA while already intoxicated. That this affects your hangover in days. This understanding doesn't really affect their behavior. During an intervention, you can explain that a higher dose of MDMA increases the chances of unwanted effects. Higher doses increase social isolation, make you feel like time passes more quickly, and can cause hallucinations. Also, the effects that you want, such as feeling euphoric, connecting with others, and socializing more easily, decrease. Click here for more info about pop.
So that was basically what was left after we went through to an organization specialized in creating these infographic kind of movie types for something that they thought would be understandable for people and shareable. So this is a good example of the kind of gap that you will have to navigate later if you end up in a job where you actually do work with behavior change. Because you might be the only person in your organization with the training, talking to colleagues who you'll have to interact with at that level, basically. Bless you. Now, oh yeah. That was the end, because this was actually kind of like an extra after the wrap up earlier. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll add the recordings to the, well, to this URL. And then enjoy the rest of the course.